why someone should care about the melting Arctic. First of all, it's that early warning system. That the rest of the globe is going to be following the Arctic. Of course, it already is, but the Arctic is leading the way. But we also have to remember that what happens in the Arctic can eventually influence what happens down in the lower latitudes, here in Boulder, Colorado, out in New York City, for example. One thing we know is that as we lose the Arctic sea ice cover, this may have effects on the circulation of the atmosphere, extending well beyond the Arctic. Because what we're doing is changing the very nature of this refrigerator. We can think of the Arctic as sort of this heat sink of the northern hemisphere, sort of the refrigerator. And by losing the ice cover, we change the nature of that refrigerator. But everything's connected together. So what happens up there influences what happens down here. There's strong evidence that we're already starting to see some of these effects. That as we lose the sea ice cover, the circulation of the atmosphere starts to respond to that. We start to see it in terms of things like changes in patterns of weather, patterns of precipitation. And it's tantalizing evidence that is just emerging. But this is not surprising us that such a thing could happen. One of the bigger concerns even that is now coming to the fore is what happens when we start to thaw the Arctic's permafrost. So what is this permafrost? It's perennially frozen ground. If you go to the Arctic and try to dig down with a shovel, even in the middle of summer, you're going to hit permafrost. You're going to hit frozen ground. And that permafrost in the Arctic is starting to warm and it's starting to thaw. So why care? Now certainly the people who live up in the Arctic care because, for example, you build a runway on permafrost and that permafrost thaws, you've got trouble. There's infrastructure problems that are arising, roads that are being greatly damaged as the permafrost thaws. So certainly in terms of infrastructure, people who live up there are already dealing with these sorts of problems. But I think the more important thing when we think globally is that there's all this carbon locked up in the permafrost. This is old frozen peatlands, things like this that contain a lot of carbon.
Is this the methane we're talking about here?
We're talking about the carbon. Well, carbon in various forms.
Okay.
Carbon can be in methane, of course, that's CH4, or as part of carbon dioxide. Well, what happens is that if we start to thaw that permafrost, the microbes in the soil start to become active now. Okay? And as a result, you start to get a release of some of this carbon back into the atmosphere, either as carbon dioxide or as methane, depending on the conditions. And this is a potentially nasty feedback. I talked about these feedbacks before, where you start something in motion and it can keep rolling. If we start to thaw that permafrost, we mobilize some of that carbon. We start to put it back into the atmosphere. But then that starts to raise atmospheric greenhouse gas levels further. The climate warms further, causes further decay of the permafrost. Now this is a feedback that's out there looming in the future, and we don't quite understand it that well. It's a wild card in the system. When will we see this feedback start to kick in? Will we see this feedback kick in? This is one of the things that really concerns me as a scientist, because it's not so much the things we know and understand that concern me, it's the wild cards in the system, the things that are out there that we don't quite understand. We know from looking at past climates, back thousands of years, that the climate system can change very quickly and it can bite very hard. Okay? We have to be very careful as we move into the future to avoid those sorts of things, these wild cards in the system. And what's happening to the permafrost may well indeed be one of these wild cards.